Welcome to the pharmaphorum podcast. This is web editor Nicole Raleigh, and today I have with me Patrick Leung, Chief Technology Officer at Faro Health, for a conversation on transforming clinical trials through AI. Welcome, Patrick.
Thanks, Nicole. I'm glad to be here.
First of all, to kick off this podcast, as our listeners have come to expect by now, Patrick, I'm going to ask you to please introduce yourself and share with us the journey that led you to doing what you do today at Faro Health.
Sure. Well, I've been in the technology industry for the past 20 plus years. I'm very new to life sciences. So before Faro Health, I was an entrepreneur, starting a couple of my own companies over the years. And I worked at Google for 10 plus years and an algorithmic hedge fund called Two Sigma in New York City for a couple of years as well. So a variety of different experiences. And for some time now, I've been applying AI to different problem domains, namely conversational, sort of lifelike conversations over the phone, which was Google Duplex. That was my first foray into applying AI into various technology products. And then at Two Sigma, I was applying AI to private investing, private equity, and venture. And then I started my own company using AI to predict tropical rainforest growth in order to secure carbon financing for various nature projects. And so that led me to Faro Health, which is using AI to basically be able to design much better clinical trials for pharma companies as well as patients and sites. And it's been a really exciting journey over the last 18 months or so to explore that domain and figure out how to make AI really have an impact.
An impact indeed. Thank you for sharing that, Patrick. And definitely wasn't expecting you to say you were working on rainforest growth and prediction in nature projects, which I really enjoyed hearing. I might come back to that in this conversation. However, right now, let's turn back to the life sciences. So you lead a team developing AI systems that streamline trial protocols and documentation. I was wondering if you could tell us how large language models, or LLMs, can be gotten into production in regulated spaces.
Yes. Well, one of the prime use cases that we're applying AI to at Faro Health is the automatic generation of clinical documentation. And for instance, the protocol document is a lengthy multi-100-page document that describes the entire trial, its design, its population, its inclusion, exclusion criteria, objectives and endpoints, lots and lots of clinical detail. And these all need to be essentially put into a document that meets regulatory approval. And as you can imagine, this is very, very, very different from using ChatGPT to compose an email. And so as a result, we built up this whole agent-based framework that closely evaluates the output of the generated content. And we've even gone one step further, and we've created a kind of like an adaptive loop that takes the results of the evaluation framework and feeds them back into the original query in order to fine-tune and to optimize the output of the model. And this is time-consuming and expensive and not something you would normally do to compose an email, for instance. But for clinical documentation that needs to be quantitatively precise and needs to meet regulatory guidelines around wording for particular topics, this is what's needed to produce documentation that actually works. And it's really been a journey, actually, to cajole, to train, to create an entire framework surrounding these large language models in order for this to actually work. And that just gives you an idea of what it takes to actually take the LLM into an enterprise regulatory and regulated environment.
This word of precision, and think about this sort of bespoke process you've been describing, that journey of creating a framework. Perhaps you could just broaden out for listeners why generic models just won't cut it in this domain.
Yeah, well, initially we actually thought they might. And so we started naively, perhaps, just asking the large language model, like a generic large language model, to generate a protocol. And then we realized, well, large language models don't do so well when you ask them to produce a whole ton of complex content. And so we divided and conquered. That was our first lesson learned, is to really hyper-focus on the various subsections in the protocol that deal with very, very specific topics, like electrocardiogram or vital signs or the rationale of the trial and things like that. These are very different topics that require very different inputs. And then fortunately, we had this tool called the Faro Study Designer, where sponsors can, in great detail, model out their clinical trial. And so we have all the objectives and endpoints and inclusion criteria, the population schema, the schedule of activities, all really well mapped out in our tool. And we can could use that as input into the process to generate some of those more typical and more detailed subsections in the protocol. So that was lesson number 2. That fortunately we were able to do in pretty short order for these highly technical sections. And then came the evaluation framework that I mentioned before. So for every single subsection in the protocol, we have a checklist of questions of different kinds that are designed to catch any hallucinations or any omissions that the large language model might generate. And for those of you new to large language models, hallucination simply means that the large language model is basically making something up that isn't true. And they have a tendency to do this unless they're closely guided, because they don't really know what's true and what's not. All they know is what a plausible string of words might be in the English language or your language of your choice. And that's what they're doing, is constructing plausible sounding strings of words, sometimes these strings of words are completely factually incorrect. And so we need to have a whole framework to make sure that the large language models don't hallucinate, and also that they don't miss things out. Because sometimes you might expect to hear about certain particular things, like details, what happens when a patient drops out of the trial, or what happens afterwards when, what's the follow-up protocol to make sure they're okay. And the language model might just forget to say that, or just not deem it necessary. And so we need to actually make sure that these details are included in the relevant subsections.
Absolutely. So if we think about the role of real world data here, what role does real world data play in quantifying and reducing patient burden?
Well, we think about patient burden a lot because it determines a lot of things. Like, one of the major challenges with clinical trials for some time now has been enrolling patients. And one of the big reasons why patients don't enroll in trials is because they're too burdensome, meaning there's way too much travel involved. There's way too much time away from their family. The procedures are onerous. There's lots of blood being taken. There's lots of invasiveness. And so there are quantitative factors such as the complexity of a procedure, its level of invasiveness, the number of procedures they get performed on the patient during a given visit, the number of visits during the course of the trial. And these all add up to an overall view of patient burden, which is something that we think a lot about. And so there's various data sources that we incorporate into our product that give clear idea of the cost and time and complexity and so on and blood volume that really allow us to provide insights into the patient burden, the overall cost, the time of the trial that can be used to really guide the design of that trial to make it friendlier for patients and sites.
Thank you, Patrick. So we've been talking a lot about technology. Technology is your background. Technology is the theme of this conversation today. So I was wondering if you could perhaps share with us why it has been said that Aaron's law is the key to understanding why drug development keeps getting slowed despite ever better technology.
Yeah, well, for the benefit of people new to the space, Eram's law is essentially a bit of dark humor, actually. It is Moore spelled backward. And I think perhaps more of your viewers are aware of the fact that Moore's law is the doubling of silicon chip density every 18 months over the course of the last 50 years. Well, in the life sciences space, we have our own version of that Eram's law, which is sadder than Moore's law because it states that every 9 years, the cost required to bring a drug to market doubles. So it's slower than Moore's law, but it's still an exponential law, and it's held over the past 50 years, inflation adjusted, which means that basically drugs now these days take on average $1 to $2 billion to get to market, which is a phenomenal amount. It's comparable to building a gigantic skyscraper or some huge project like that. And there are a number of factors that have conspired to make this the case. One of them is, every time there's a fentanyl crisis or an opioid crisis of some kind, regulators get just that much more conservative and just that much more careful about ensuring that, for instance, in this case, a drug doesn't have addictive qualities. So that's one factor, is that over time, the regulators just get a bit more conservative with good reason because of public health crises such as that. Another is, as the standard of care, as the medications for a particular condition become more and more advanced, the bar to actually beat that standard goes up. And so for a drug company to introduce a new drug, for instance, that might combat obesity, they now have Ozempic and the like, these GLPs. They have these GLP drugs to compete with. And so the standard is higher, and therefore it's more difficult to develop a successor. So anyway, there's a number of these different factors that also, I would say one factor as well is the fact that many of these next generation drugs, genetic therapies, and so on are just inherently more difficult to test, to design trials for. They need to be more thorough and more complex. And so these all add up. And I think the thought here that's going on right now in the industry is, well, finally we have a technology that can combat this effect. We now have these really powerful AI models. They can combat bend Abrams' curve downward and bring the cost of drugs and the time required to bring them to market downwards. And that's actually really one of the great hopes we have at Faro Health, is that through our tools and through the way that we're applying AI, we can actually start to reduce the cost. But we have a lot to work with in the form of the current state of the industry and the way things are done.
Yes, we do indeed. And the conversation around the need for change in current frameworks for new therapies is an entirely other conversation that would take us well beyond the bounds of today's discussion. So if we come back to AI, final question for you, Patrick. What is your crystal ball telling you about the future of AI, not perhaps in the natural sciences and rainforests, but in the life sciences?
Well, for sure, my hope is that through the use of AI, we can build ever better trials, meaning clinical trials that meet their objectives more successfully, that are way less burdensome on the patient, and that are attractive to a whole bunch of different sites, so they get completed with lower cost and with less impact on the patient, and hopefully better outcomes. And I think as a result of that, if you just sort of fast forward that and say in the next 5 to 10 years, we're going to create better and better clinical trials, then the hope is that the huge amounts of innovation that are going on early on in the drug discovery stage with all these new treatments that I kind of alluded to before, that more and more of those will make it into patients' hands earlier and earlier. And there'll be more innovation in the sense that the bar to getting a trial through trial, the bar to getting a new drug through clinical trials will go down, hopefully. And as a result, there'll just be greater range at lower cost and just more amazing treatments that are available to patients earlier. And hopefully that will alleviate suffering and save lives and lengthen them and so on. And that's ultimately the goal of this company. And I think the goal of this entire industry is to help patients live longer and better lives. And I really look forward to that. I'm sure many people, perhaps most, have loved ones that have succumbed to various conditions that, might benefit from some of these treatments that are early on in their stage of discovery. And so the sooner we get them to market, the better for humanity, really.
A shared goal indeed. Thank you, Patrick. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you so much, Nicole. It's really been a fun conversation.
And that concludes another episode of the pharmaphorum podcast. You can find more information about this episode, including a download link and information about previous installments at pharmaphorum.com/podcasts. The pharmaphorum podcast is also available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Overcast, Pocket Casts, Podbean, and pretty much wherever else you download your other podcasts from. Just search for pharmaphorum and follow and hit subscribe. Of course, don't forget to visit our website itself, where you can sign up for daily and weekly news and analysis bulletins. And do follow us on Blue Sky and LinkedIn at pharmaphorum. That's all for now. Thank you for listening.